So today I'm going to be talking about a little tiny little subject called the meaning of life. Yes, it's a pretty big one. And I'm not going to be able to boil everything down into a short little talk, but I'm going to try to give you the big picture because learning about this big picture has really helped me to find a solid foundation for all the important things like mental well-being and even physical well-being, but obviously spiritual well-being. So, what we're really talking about here is finding the grand meta narrative of the Bible. Now, meta narrative is just a fancy word for the big story. It's the summary of something big in a tiny little package that we can take out and examine and understand really simply and tuck it back into our heart and then take it back out when we need to. So every book has a meta-narrative, and of course my favorite genre is the psychological thriller. And even psychological thrillers each has this big take-home message that you don't discover till the very end of the book. And every really good psychological thriller starts out with some kind of a big bang. Something really scary and confusing happens, and you are immediately hooked to the plot. As the story continues, the main character begins to question his or her sanity. There's usually a lot of chaos and some physical threat and some fear, terror, and puzzling and mysterious things happen. Then there's a dramatic climax, some kind of a plot twist, and the mystery is unveiled. And then at the very end, peace and sanity is restored, and that is a satisfying psychological thriller. Interestingly, the Bible is no different. There's a story, a grand story, that starts from the book of Genesis and is woven throughout until the very final book of the Bible, which is the book of Revelation. And it's one big story, and it's actually one simple message, and we're going to figure that out today. The message that's in that big story is so pivotal that it helps us to answer the big questions that everybody has. Questions like, why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? Does life have meaning? Do my day-to-day experiences have meaning? And from the very first few pages of the Bible, God starts to answer those questions for us. But the answers are super unexpected and probably not what you've heard. If you ever attended Sunday school as a little kid, you've heard the story of the Garden of Eden, of Adam and Eve. You've probably heard it in a way where it felt like God was pretty disappointed in the way that mankind has turned out. And when you're operating from that kind of a baseline, you spend your whole life feeling like you have this God in heaven who's just kind of vaguely disappointed in you. But we have a number of clues in the book of Genesis that show us a whole different meta-narrative. So I'm going to go through 5 different clues that are in the Bible right in this first book, this first description of how everything was created. And those clues are going to lead us to some of the answers to those questions I already referenced. Okay, clue number 1, God already knew. When you read the Bible as a whole, you begin to get some really vital clues about God's character, about who he is and what he's like. One of the things that we learn about God is that he's all-knowing. So he's never surprised or disappointed with how things turned out. In fact, he already knew how everything was going to turn out from the very beginning. This is an important clue to the meta-narrative that's woven throughout the Bible. And if you need biblical support for the fact that God already knows everything, Psalm 139:4 says, "Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely." So before we can even speak it or think it, God already knows what is about to happen. So if we go back to the very beginning of time and we read in Genesis, we see that God was fashioning Adam's body out of dirt. And even as he was lovingly sculpting this creature that had no life in it yet out of dirt, he already knew the end of the story. He already knew how it would turn out. So in God's mind, as he was creating this creature in his own image, he already knew that there would be wars and there would be chaos and there would be a world with violence. And yet he still finished with Adam, breathed life into him, and said, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. That's in Genesis 1:31. And he was able to say that because he knew that this was the beginning of a love story. He knew how the love story would turn out. He knew that there would be lots of bad points in between, lots of plot twists and pain, but the ultimate ending is a grand love story nonetheless. Now, we have clue number 2. God actually brought it about. So when we look at the story of Adam and Eve, one of the questions that came to my mind was, where did the snake come from? God created everything that was in the Garden of Eden. He created Adam, he created Eve, he created all the animals, the trees, and he also created the snake. So the serpent itself was created by God, and not only that, but it was designed to have a extremely crafty nature. The exact description in the Bible is this: "Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made." So we see here that God created the serpent, and he also designed it to be extremely smart. That word, cunning or crafty, means able to lie in a very convincing manner. So the snake was created by God, and its nature was designed to be very sneaky. And before anything can get misunderstood, I just want to say that, of course, God is not the one who tempts us. God does not put anything in front of us to try to make us stumble. That's not in his nature. But he does allow things to tempt us. He does allow things to tempt us that will bring about a good plan. And so that's what we see here. So it was the snake himself that tempted us, but God already knew it was going to happen, and it was part of God's design for the overall big plan. So we have a creature that's extremely crafty and cunning and able to deceive. And then let's take a look at Adam and Eve's natures. So they have had two people, each other, to interact with, and God. So it can be assumed that they've never run across any person or any creature that has lied to them before. So they have no experience with the fact that something or someone can lie to them. So they're very, very innocent. And in fact, I would say they are very, very naive. When we have a friendship where someone lies to us, maybe the first time we might fall for it. Then we discover that lying is possible in that friendship. And from there on out, we've learned something, and our development has increased to the point where we know not to trust everything everyone says. That's not where Adam and Eve were. They are fresh and newly developed, and they have literally no experience with lying. So in some ways, they were extremely vulnerable. Their very natures were so innocent and undeveloped that they literally had no armor against anyone trying to trick them. So for the more cynical among us, we might ask ourselves, it seems like a little bit of a setup. Why would God set up mankind, basically making everything fall into place so that they would make the wrong decision? I can't imagine this going any other way than for Adam and Eve to listen to what the snake told them and believe them. So let's move on to clue number 3, which is, what exactly did the snake tell them they would gain? The snake was able to trick Adam and Eve into eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. He basically promised them that they would be able to become more like God. Now, wanting to become more like God doesn't seem particularly evil to me, and it's not. But what the snake was subtly implying is that God did not really love Adam and Eve, that he was holding something back from them that was good for them. This is the crux of what the temptation was all about, that there was something about God that wasn't fully loving. So obviously we know they fell for it, and they did indeed gain the ability to judge good from evil. And the very first thing they did was felt ashamed. They realized they were naked. I think that with their ability to judge good and evil, they were able to realize the differences between them, mankind, and God. So, it seems pretty clear to me that God has no parts for reproduction. And this was something that Adam and Eve did have, and they were ashamed of being naked, and they immediately tried to cover their nakedness. So for the first time ever, we find Adam and Eve feeling the depths of fear and shame, and understanding that they are separate and different from God. This was something brand new for them because they had never even thought about such things. Before, they were just friends with God. When you have a child in the early stages of development, the child doesn't even really realize that they're separate from their parents. That comes later in development. And that's kind of what we see with Adam and Eve here. They didn't even think about those things, and then all of a sudden their eyes were opened and they realized that they were apart and different from God. We actually know that the word holy means other than or separate. So for the first time ever, Adam and Eve realized that God was holy, other than them, and separate from them, and it brought fear and shame. He was and is holy, and they are not. They're just humans. So it seemed like we did, in fact, gain an ability. We gained the ability to judge, but what was missing with that ability was also the perfect love and the holiness of God. That's the kind of love that only God has. He has that all knowing, perfect love that can both judge and discern between good and evil and do it perfectly. And we don't have that. So, clue number 4, just who is this God? What is he like? As I mentioned before, the real kicker in the fall was that the serpent very subtly suggested that God was a liar, and in fact, that he was cheating them out of something good. And this is the part that I think gets really brutal, and this is what a large part of the overall story of the Bible is about. It's what we believe about God. The exact words that the serpent used were this. He says, "You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So here we find that the snake is implying that God had lied to them about dying, that they weren't really going to die. God just said that to trick them, and that the reason why he wanted to trick them was because he was holding something back from them. He didn't really have their utmost good in his mind. So I think the question is that maybe Adam and Eve thought, maybe he's not such a good caretaker. Maybe he doesn't really love us. And so they believed the lie. Whenever we doubt God's loving character, it causes all sorts of problems. And the word problems is actually a huge understatement. When I really mean that the greatest sufferings and evils in human history can be directly linked to either a refusal to believe that God exists or a massive perversion of what he's actually like, a massive change to his character. Religious wars, genocides, even Hitler, these can all be directly traced back to a false belief about the nature of God, who God is, what God's like. And it really doesn't get any more serious than that. So it's really important what we believe about God and what we believe he's like. Now our final clue, number 5, cast out and yet pursued. So as a result of Adam and Eve falling for the snake's lies and tasting the fruit and suddenly being able to judge good and evil, they were cast out of the Garden of Eden. This is the part where we are likely to interpret that God was mad and disappointed at Adam and Eve. In fact, he did make their life a whole lot harder after that. Childbirth, he declared, would be much more painful, that farming for mankind would become incredibly difficult. And yet, there are also other clues. He also does something else. He immediately gives them gifts. Now, that's bizarre. They've just done exactly what he asked them not to do, and he gives them gifts. He actually made them clothing to cover their nakedness. And then there's a second thing that he does. He drives them out of the Garden of Eden. And when we begin reading the next chapter, when Adam and Eve are outside of the Garden of Eden, we find that God is still right there. So apparently, God also left the Garden of Eden to follow mankind and interact with them. The next story is about Cain and Abel, and we find, an interaction between them. He's still right there. He has, in fact, pursued them out of the Garden of Eden. So the rest of the Bible, after this, all the way leading up to the start of the New Testament, is kind of a story of human messiness, and yet God's still there interacting and pursuing them, even in their messiness. Sometimes his perfect love it hovered as a cloud for his people. Sometimes it appeared as a fire, but it was always intricately woven into these stories of messy humans. And we also see God's tremendous power. The Old Testament is a lot of displays of God's power, his otherness from us, his holiness. He is so much greater and bigger than mankind. And during the Old Testament stories, in fact, he was considered so holy that to even look at him could cause death. That's how separate and different he is from us. Even though we didn't realize it when we were Adam and Eve walking in the garden, that's the truth of the matter. He is so far above us. So when they built the temple and they basically wanted to build a place where God might live, they also built a giant, heavy, heavy curtain. And the curtain protected the people from getting too far into the temple where the most holy part of God lived. And they believed that if they were to go past that curtain, basically they would die because of the holiness of God. So after all these stories of wars and judgment and anguish and God intermingling with all of it, we reach the grand climax of the story. This is the plot twist, and this is the beginning of the New Testament where Jesus enters the scene. So this is the plot twist for the psychological thriller. This is where the mystery is unraveled and we have that aha moment. This is what it was all about. First, we need to know exactly who Jesus is. Jesus is, in fact, God himself. That same God that created Adam allowed himself to become a fragile baby. God's Spirit entered actually the ovum of a woman to become a man that was born that was both 100% human and yet 100% God. That's who Jesus is. So the very same God that created the Grand Canyon, the Pacific Ocean, that was able to turn rivers into blood and move mountains and wipe out evil kingdoms, allowed himself to be born as a fragile human baby. Now, if that's not the greatest illustration of God pursuing man, I don't know what is. God left all behind to join us in our messy humanness. So we see that unbelievably relentless chasing love pursued us all the way down from heaven to join us. You have to imagine God himself was a fragile baby that slowly began to eat solid foods, that learned how to walk and fell many times, that would catch the common cold and would grow up to someday wash the feet of his friends. That's how far God went to pursue us. Not only did he wash the feet of his friends, but he also experienced the worst of human pain and suffering. He allowed himself to be murdered. At any moment, he could have called that off. He's God after all, but he allowed himself to suffer the worst of human suffering to show us that he loves us. And this was all done as an offering, a grand gesture of his love. So we learned something extremely poignant about the nature of God. He is perfect love. In all the billion ways that love can be expressed, it can be expressed in protection, it can be expressed in pursuing. Sometimes love holds back for the greater good. Sometimes love allows suffering for the greater good. But perfect love can be expressed in a million different ways. And God is the master painter of perfect love. And he is always pursuing us because he wants us. He adores us. He is pursuing me and he's pursuing you with his love. So we have the grand mystery of this psychological thriller is finally revealed. We start out in the very beginning with God giving us a guideline to not eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. He knew that we wouldn't listen to it. We ate from it anyway. It made things harder for us. We believed the snake about God's character and that he wasn't quite loving us 100%. We learned how to judge, but we didn't have the perfect love necessary to go along with it. In fact, what we need above all things is perfect love. And in fact, that is what he offers us. So if I were to sum up the entire meaning of life, the grand meta-narrative of the Bible, I would put it like this. God pursues us with his perfect love. We are what he's always wanted. Will we believe it? And if you'll remember at the moment of his death, that curtain that was meant to keep people away from that separateness from God, that super holiness that could kill us, that curtain tore from top to bottom. It's another example of God throwing his arms wide open and saying, come to me. We were separate, but now we're not. And in fact, when we choose to believe this message that God loves us, that that's what Jesus came for, that he made all things perfect and right between us and God, we actually get a deposit. We have God's Spirit actually living inside of us. Now, could you get any closer to God? I don't know if you've ever felt like you're chasing after God, that you have to do certain things to get God to pay attention to you or to favor you. You feel like you have to have a certain amount of prayer time, or you need to read your Bible, or you need to go to church. If you believe in Jesus, he's right there inside of you. And we just have to believe it, believe that he's living inside of us, and trust that. An interesting thing about having God's Spirit live in us and believing in it and resting in it more and more, resting in that perfect relationship with God, is that we start to get a little bit better at loving. We get better at both loving ourselves and we get better at loving others. So that perfect love begins to grow inside of us. And it takes a lifetime to continue growing as we learn more and more about how to do things in perfect love, but we do get better at it. And in fact, We are so close to God that we are united with him because he's living inside of us. And I want to read you a Bible verse in case you've ever doubted that God is close to you. It says in John 14:20, "In that day you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you." Those are the words of Jesus. And then in 1 Corinthians 6:17, it says, "But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him." So that pursuing love, God pursuing us, has been realized, and we are together. We are fully loved by God, and we are as close as a relationship can be. So we then come to the ending of this psychological thriller. The ending of the grand story is also important to the meta narrative. So we started out the Bible in a Garden of Eden, so a paradise, right? It was beautiful, and then it looked like we lost all that. But we find at the very end of the Bible that we actually not only have a paradise, but we have a paradise that has been developed that we are living in. So in the book of Revelation, it describes what our future is. And our future is that we're going to live in a city that's literally made out of gold and pearls and jewels. And it has trees in it that produce fruits, and those fruits are for healing. And there's a river that runs through the middle of it. And it's not just a river, it's called a river of life. So it's like we've taken the paradise from the Garden of Eden, and it's been developed and multiplied and made even more grand. And that's where the story ends. Not only that, but we're living in this golden city, and God himself is there 24/7 in a way that we can actually see him. He is the light for the city. So there's no moon, and there's no sun, and there's no stars. It's just God shining all the time. So that's how close our relationship is with him. That's how obvious he is. We've gone from walking in the garden in a paradise every now and then with God to literally being with God 24/7 in a super developed, rich, opulent city. That's who our God is. Our God is generous, and he is perfect love, and he has pursued us through all time. And now we are together. That's the end of the story. And in fact, in Revelation, it says that in this future place that we will be living in, there is no more mourning or suffering or pain. And I think that's important because suffering, of all the things on this earth that cause us to question or doubt God, suffering is probably the biggest one. And I know that when I go through a hard time, I think, why, God? Why did you allow this? Why didn't you warn me? Why wouldn't you have protected me? And suffering has a funny way of, in this time period, in this lifetime, of actually strengthening our faith. We need to question, and we need to doubt in order to get answers to those questions and answers to those doubts. So suffering serves a purpose in this lifetime, but in the future, there will be no suffering. There will be no pain. It will all be finished. So this grand story of the Bible, this grand story of the meaning of life, answers the following questions for us. Number 1, why am I here? I am here to be loved. I'm here to believe in his love for me and for everyone around me. So I'm here to soak up God's love. And when I soak up God's love and I believe in it with all my heart, that love spills out to the people around me, the people I interact with. It's love and love and love. Question number 2, what is my purpose in life? Well, it's kind of the same thing. It's to love and to be loved. In as many unique possible ways as you could ever consider. If you want to be a trampoline tester, a mustard maker, a French fryer for God, go for it. There is no desire in your heart that can't be accomplished for God's glory in any unique, interesting way that you might think of. In fact, you can be assured that those interests and those passions that are unique to you have been put there by God, and they are there for a reason. And it's to enjoy your relationship with God and to love others. So what is my daily challenge? That challenge is to believe it. We are always going to be tempted to believe that God doesn't love us, that he's holding something back from us, that he doesn't have our best interests in mind. And the more that we believe in God's genuine pursuing love for us, the healthier we will be. There will always be some trickery, just like in the Garden of Eden and the serpent, to get me to try to second guess God's character and to try to cause me to doubt whether he really loves me or not. I believe a whole bunch of sin and evil comes from the idea that God doesn't love me, so I've got to do something to take matters into my own hands. But we, in this day and age, have the unusual advantage of thousands of years of history and the entire written Bible as a basis for that meta narrative. It's there to show us over and over again that God is pursuing us with his grand love. And each day I'm going to have to choose between do I believe that he has perfect love towards me, or do I believe that he's angry, disappointed, absent, uninvolved? What we believe about him will be translated into our actions every day of our life. If I believe I woke up this morning and I believe God's disappointed with me, I'm going to do things that kind of match that. And if I woke up this morning believing that God loves me and delights in me, I'm going to do good things to match that. So today I would like to challenge you to start looking for clues of God's pursuing love in your life. Every good thing that you've ever been given is a gift from God to pursue you in his love. He is a God that knows absolutely everything about us. He understands me and you like nobody else in the world can, and yet he still feels complete love for us. And he's chasing after me and you. It's a grand romance that plays out day by day. It doesn't always feel like a romance because we're living in a fallen world where a lot of evil and anti-love exists. But I am always, always, always assured that I am perfectly loved and that he has removed all judgment, and that was the message of the cross, that all judgment, all disappointment, all possibility of anger of God towards me, gone. So as I stumble and fall and messily live my life, which I do messily live my life, I remain perfectly loved. In the good times, in the bad times, I remain perfectly loved. And like I mentioned before, I am slowly getting better at loving. I go forward, I go a few steps back, but I am getting better at loving. And the more God loves me, the longer he loves me, the better I get at loving others. And with all that, he's also given us the freedom to accept or reject his pursuing love. So I could choose to reject love and the ways of love. We've got lots of lessons from history of people who have chosen to do evil and to go in the ways of evil and forget about love. Pretty much evil is all things that is either the absence of love or the opposite of love. And I can assure you that God hates this. God's nature is not a wimpy, soft, pushover kind of love. It's a fiery, powerful, majestic love that hates all evil. It hates the absence of love. It hates when people hurt each other. It hates when children are abused, and it hates when our elderly are ignored, and it hates when power is corrupted. So a big part of love is hating evil. But with that said, God never hates us. He's written out 1,000 years of history to reveal how much he loves us and pursues us with his love. I guess the question left is, do we believe it? So to finish this talk out, I've included in the notes a number of Bible verses that support this idea of pursuing love. And also, I did come across a book as I was researching this topic it kind of expands with biblical stories on this idea of a pursuing love, of God pursuing man. And I'm going to give you a link to that book. It's a great book. And if you've ever felt like you just can't seem to get close to God, this will reassure you that you already are close to God, that he's the one that's pursuing you. And my prayer for anyone watching this is that every day you become more and more aware of God's perfect love turned towards you, that you are unique and you are interesting and you are beloved and you are a delight to God. And he will show you every day through pain, suffering, through joy and gladness, through gifts. It's all intertwined together to show you that he is pursuing you with his love and he couldn't love you anymore. And Jesus is the grand display of that. Thank you.